Tamsen, thank you for joining me. Where does today's recording find you?
Relieved that we finally connected. Physically in Boston. Mentally, still somewhere between here in New York, where I just was for school at a conference and a client. But in life, just legitimately excited about things that I'm working on and studying, and finding more about and just figuring out how to get all that into the world. So I'm in a good place. Several good
It's good
places.
to hear.
Yeah. I'm a little tired though. But I'm gonna hold it. I'm gonna keep it all together as much as I can.
You and I both. I guess I didn't mention this before we started recording, but sadly, I've been up since about 1:30 this morning. So I have my energy going for this, thankfully. And, I'm a fan of
Oh,
yours. I have both of your books here on my table. And I tell everyone, in particular, from my perspective, your first book is the best book on messaging that I've ever read. So
thank you.
I like I said, that I have the energy for this conversation. So thank you for making the time. And as you sort of said, I forget how you put it, it's been a long time coming. So it's nice that we're
It
finally
has.
here.
Yes, it has. Well, thank you for your kind words about that first book. Yeah, I think one of the things that's in my head right now is, um, yeah, what to do with it. I think probably, yeah, I'm feeling like my next thing that I would publish is a completely revised and updated version of that book. Uh, because I am working on some new stuff, which is highly related with my doctoral work and all of that. But it feels like there's enough of it that's there that I could integrate it into Find Your Red Thread, and make it even stronger. Because I've learned a lot in the last 4 years since I published that book about, how to make certain pieces of it easier, how to make the whole thing stronger. Um, but the general concepts are still the same. So, but thanks. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
I'll keep you posted on like second edition.
I appreciate that. Well, you have referenced school and your doctoral studies, and we mentioned that you've written books, but just take me back briefly a little bit through either your journey or if somebody asks you to describe yourself, give me the brief version of what you would say about yourself so that we can bring ourselves up to speed on
Yeah.
who
Yeah.
you are, what you're doing, and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that, my day-to-day job, the kind of official title that I have assigned to myself is a message designer. And when people say, "What's that?" I say, "It's an English to English translator." Um, uh, and, expanding a little bit further, I really see what I do is I help people make things make sense so that other people will change their thinking and behavior about those things. Um, I have at the heart of that work, I mean, in one way or another, I've been doing that work for 25 years. So 25 years, one big question: how do we accelerate the understanding and adoption of new ideas? And really importantly, that's become part of my work over the last 10 years. How do we do that without coercion, without manipulation, while honoring people's agency, while giving full information, full transparency? Um, and I know that sounds like it might be an impossible task, but that's part of what I've gotten so excited about with my work over the last couple of years in my doctoral research is that it's not. And, there's little hints in there, but, with the work I've been doing with my clients over the past 2 years, particularly, um, I really believe that that's possible. And, it is much like the red thread. It is a straightforward approach. Doesn't mean that it's always like, snap your fingers easy. But it's pretty exciting. And like I said, yeah, I've been doing that for years and years and years. So from, anything where you can imagine where people need or want other people's buy-in, conviction, genuine belief in a new idea in order to create change. I've probably done that position, whether that's marketing, branding, sales, messaging. Been the CMO, been a director of marketing, worked in agencies, worked in organizations, for profits, nonprofits, startups, Fortune 10s, entrepreneurs, thought leaders, academics, moonlighting jobs as a Weight Watchers leader and a TEDx producer and idea strategist. But really, it all just comes down to how do we make things make sense so we can help make change happen faster?
Is that ultimately what you mean when you say English to English translators? Like, I say words, and from my perspective, I all those words make sense, but
Yes.
what's received on your end is different from what I think I'm communicating.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's probably several different ways that I interpret that. It covers most of the ways that I mean, however you think about it. I think the go-to way in my own head is, it's often expertise to everyday language. In other words, how do I take an idea, a concept, or something that was developed in one domain, let's say a super technical, a lot of my clients are tech startups, often climate tech, regenerative agriculture, things that people aren't familiar with. And how do I help them translate it? And more importantly, learn the skill of translation so that they can reliably talk about their work to the wide variety of people they need to talk to, whether that's investors or their board or people they're trying to hire, or even internally to get everybody on the same page when not everybody is a scientist, an engineer, a technologist, or something like that. So I often think about it in that context because, in the grand scheme of things, I feel that's where, like, my heart is, like, I love big ideas, I love people who work for ideas, bigger than themselves, um, and so in that context, those are often the people who need the most help in translating their idea from how they see it into terms and concepts that other people can understand. But fundamentally, that's the work for everybody, right? It's just that how I make sense of things is different than how you make sense of things. I've recently been reading it was from Mick Herron, the Slow Horses novels that are behind the Slow Horses show on uh, Apple Plus, I think. Anyway, there is a great quote from the main character that says that the fact that a word can mean multiple things, the same word can mean multiple things to multiple people is why we shouldn't trust them. Um, and that's a lot of it, right? Like, anybody who has an idea, whether they're a leader and they're just trying to, drive compliance, or, you're an inventor or a technologist or something like that, your idea inside and out, and a level of expertise that nobody else has about it. And just because of how we're wired and how we come to understand things, it's hard to get that big, beautiful idea packed into these untrustworthy words so that they get transferred to somebody else in a way that still captures the big, beautiful nature of that idea without overwhelming people and going, I have no idea what you're talking about.
When I have read your work, or not just your books, but also reading your articles over time or things that you post on LinkedIn or whatever else, I have often felt like in this, I don't know, sort of Venn diagram of complementary ideas, and, there's rarely perfect overlap, that there's a lot to be said for, in your thinking, for empathy, or approaches like jobs theory or jobs to be done theory. And there are probably plenty of other things. I feel like I've seen you post about things like Chris Argyris's sort of frameworks and so on. I don't recall if you've written about Edgar Schein, but he had a very similar approach, but from sort of org culture, that perspective. But all of that said, the subtitle of your first book is "Make Your Big Ideas Irresistible," and then the subtitle, I believe, of your second book is something about lasting change. And if I recall correctly, in your second book, Say What They Can't Unhear, I think, do you state that some of your motivation for that was that it's not just about, I guess, drawing people into your idea or making it irresistible, but also saying things in a way that, well, they can't unhear it, but that, it that it sticks with them over time?
Yes, absolutely. Right. Yeah. So it was interesting when I wrote that second book because people are like, "Oh, you're changing your focus." And I'm like, "Oh my gosh, no." Like it's the same, like I've always been like, if anything, Say What They Can't Unhear is even closer to my heart because I have been in that question about how do we accelerate the understanding and adoption of new ideas. I mean, I truly see the work that I've been doing over the last 25 years. So I have been in change communications for that entire time. And in a huge different, a huge variety of places. And in fact, my first job out of grad school, first round, was as a change management consultant. Um, and then for many of the years afterwards, while I was doing branding and marketing, I was moonlighting as a Weight Watchers leader. And what I observed was there was a big tension between what marketing or persuasion or influence or sales, like all that kind of theory and whatever was supposed to do, didn't actually work long term for people at an individual level. Um, so that was one piece of it. And then another point of information that kind of went into the whole brain blender with this was that most of the time where I was working in organizations or with organizations, and this is still true to my heart, they were resource constrained would be a very kind way to put it, right? I spent the first 15 years of my career in nonprofits. I still love working with academics, researchers, startups, again, not swimming in money. And so because of that and also how my brain works. And while I'm in the process, frankly, of getting officially assessed for my levels and varieties of neurodivergency. I do have some traits that are highly consistent. And part of that comes into um, not wanting to revisit things. I only want to do things once. And so I'm going to do something to figure out so that I don't have to keep thinking about it. And so all of that came together by saying, like, listen, I can use all these things that marketing and sales things say I should be able to do to get someone to yes. But I see in the meeting room that doesn't, if they don't genuinely believe it, if they don't genuinely understand it, if it in fact weakens their own self-perception or their own self-efficacy in a certain way, their belief in that they have the capability of doing something, this is not an action that's going to sustain. So I became really interested in what was I learning in the meeting room about what was more effective to get someone to shift, like permanently, deeply, broadly, and durably change their way of thinking so that it translated in a way of behavior. And what did they need to hear from me in order to start that process? And what were the conditions that needed to be present in that room? And then I started to figure out how could I replicate that in my day job. So all of that to say, in my mind, this is an interesting exercise in translation. Making your idea irresistible and saying what somebody can't unhear is me saying the same thing in two different ways. And the principles of lasting change are that's the that's the reason why it's so important. And if you can say something that sticks in someone's head because they it can acknowledge, even if it's just at first, the intuitive truth of that, the intuitive sense making, it makes sense both intuitively and intellectually to them. Even if they don't change right away, it sits in their brain, right? And then oftentimes will eventually lead to a shift down the line. So for me, these both of these concepts are intimately connected, because what I have seen in my work and now what I'm diving deeper into my research is that there are a certain set of like mental conditions of how we make meaning and how we make sense of things that in like you put the right set of things together and both things happen, right? You make something, a new idea, irresistible. It leads to the behavior change that would follow, and therefore the lasting change comes from it.
What are some of the things that you are learning in your research or any aspects of your doctoral work?
So the degree, it's an educational doctorate, an EDD in adult learning and leadership. And the reason why I was so interested in adult learning is that new ideas, kind of by definition, require some form of teaching, right? And yet, as I look at the business literature, I've spent the last 20 years as a speaker, working with speakers, again, speaking as part of business development for various day jobs, et cetera. That is a piece of that, like, business literature has cherry picked from, like, every other discipline, except for the one that's actually at the heart of all the change that everybody is. So that was bananas to me. And I was like, I want to know more about how people and how adults in particular learn. Um, so that I can again just serve that big question in my head even better. So my goodness, all sorts of things. I think that they are, anything that I would tell you is probably not a shocker. Somebody, they're like, well, of course. I'm like, yeah, and we're not doing that. Like, I think the biggest thing that's been exciting to me is that we assume that transformational shifts in perspective like that must be conscious, must be the process of, critical reflection and lots of dialogue and lots of steps, because a lot of our examples and a lot of the official examples are right. So whether you're thinking about, therapy, or you're thinking about, kind of big transformational projects or whatever in organizations, everyone's like, wow, it's just going to take us like, a year or two, whatever. And even then, not everyone's going to be on board. So there's this real, and it's a critique of some of the theories, but there's this real focus on like rational thought processes that are entailed in perspective change. And so this is where I came in from, again, not necessarily the official theory and language of marketing and sales, but from, again, my 13 years of, like lived experience with people making big changes and my own, because, I've sustained a 50-pound weight loss for 25 years now. Um, I have seen, and everybody I've ever talked to has had an experience where they heard one thing and everything changed. And it wasn't a long process, and it wasn't necessarily a painful process. Like, it may have been difficult to implement that change afterwards, but the actual shift wasn't different. So this is like, woof, I have so much fun, like just, figuring that piece out. But more broadly, I think one of the things that I really enjoy about kind of the field of adult learning, is how much more advanced that field is in understanding how people take in information, which would be, in my mind, seems to to be wildly important for leaders. But I think the biggest thing that people would probably recognize from their own experience is about that privileging, that prioritization of this rational thought process. Um, when I'm paraphrasing one of the books that I've read in the last year, but the way that the idea came, that I've processed it and kept it with me, is that there is nothing that your mind knows that your body didn't experience first. Your eyes took the information, your ears took it in, like, you felt it, like and and just saying that means, why are we ignoring so often the felt experience of something? Because that's actually the first way that it comes in. And whatever the conditions are for that really affect what happens after. That's one thing. The other thing that I have found to be really, juicy and delicious as I get into it, um, is how, again, in how it's gotten translated into the business world and the business thought leadership. People often, if they have recognized that they are over prioritizing the rational, oftentimes what's held up as the opposite is the emotional, and that is like one slice of the other half, right? And so, I've evolved. I think I just posted about it fairly recently. to thinking about it much more as the analytic brain and the automatic brain, and where things like emotion, but also intuition and learned patterns and behaviors and that felt experience and, ooh, that stove is hot, let me take my hand off, like that those two things are operating at the same time. So just in even those set of concepts, it is just like I am an absolute kid in a candy store, just kind of learning more and figuring out more and kind of seeing where the gaps are, not only in adult learning theory, but also how that has some of those kind of sometimes faulty assumptions have carried through all the way into how we are handling strategic communications, et cetera. And so it's been just an absolute blast.
If I choose to look at some of what you're saying through a framework, let's say, of or an explanation of some of the reasons for some of these things as well, there's so much that goes on in the unconscious mind, and then the conscious mind has so little processing, or there's post hoc rationalization of activities or whatever else. If I come at it from that perspective, or I feel like that explains a lot of what you're saying, do you have a reaction to that as in I'm leaving things out or
I mean, so it's always complex, right? So that's the thing that we always need to be on the. But I would say, the essence of that is 100% correct, which is when we receive information, it's not that there's a lack of processing on that automatic side, is that it's just that we are not conscious of that processing. And yet what's really important to understand about that automatic, intuitive, shortcut, heuristic, instinct, intuition driven side of ourselves is that because it's fast and because it's faster than the analytical side, it it has a lot to say about whatever makes it into our conscious, rational brains, and it it definitely colors. I mean, even Kahneman was seeing this work. It definitely colors the 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 way that the rational brain receives the information. So, for instance, and so this is the heart of what I've been working on for the last couple of years. I'm like, how do we talk to both brains at once, right? Because again, I have to get in order for someone to understand and adopt a new idea, I have to one of the elements is not only understanding, which is where Find Your Red Thread was coming in. I was really trying to say, like, well, what do people need to understand? Um, but 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 more importantly, how do I avoid triggering the things that are most likely to get in the way of once somebody understands of that kind of intuitive felt response to whatever it is I'm saying. In other words, how can I, right? Because if I give you data that you don't agree with, that's not going to do anything for you. And in fact, that's now going to, like, your immediate kind of gut brain response is that's not correct. And therefore, anything else I tell you is going to be processed by that rational brain of I don't trust this person. I don't trust their sources. I don't see the world the same way they do. Or if somebody just says, do this, again, that triggers that piece as well, because we don't like to have the perception of control taken away from us. And so when you just tell someone to do something, that's going to trigger it too. So a lot of my work really started from, okay, what triggers it? How do we avoid that? But how do we avoid it without I see a lot of people kind of leveraging psychological loopholes in what I would term ethically questionable ways. In other words, there are a lot of times they're using psychological techniques on people without a training and at least actual psychological training, and or they're using it without those people's knowledge, that goes against a lot of what I think about. So the work in my mind, given all of that, is that it really comes down to how do you talk to both brains simultaneously, particularly in the beginning in the first introductions of the idea, because that's often where they fail, right? The other day I was giving a talk to it was the closing keynote at the High Spot customer conference, the Spark conference. And I asked the audience, I was like, I knew it was Seattle, so I knew there'd be baseball fans. And I'm like, all right, baseball fans, in what inning do most perfect games get broken up? Right. And people were like, ninth and seventh. And then someone goes, first. And I'm like, exactly. Like the first time somebody gets on base, that's the perfect game getting broken up. And that's in a lot of ways how I see the process of a new idea is that a lot of times people think that it fails in implementation or whatever. And I suspect there's a lot of times where it fails with the first batter, right? It fails with how it was the first time somebody heard about it. It triggered that automatic brain to go, I don't know about that. And once that's happened, it's really, really, really hard to ever get the automatic brain on board. It can happen. I mean, that's also part of Kahneman's work. The analytic brain does exist to correct misinterpretations by that automatic brain in one way. But to me, that's the thing. And we've either been talking to one side or the other, right? Either we overweight on emotions and storytelling and visioning and values alignment, or we overweight on data and analysis and evidence and rational arguments. And I'm like, y'all, it's both processes operating at the same time. We've got to find a way to unite them. And in a reliable way that most people who are trying to lead change can feel they can do, right? So storytelling does a lot of that naturally, which I think is why everyone thinks it's like the end all be all. It's really good, but it's not everything because every story is just an argument in disguise. So if you don't know what that argument is, and if that argument is based on concepts or beliefs that people either don't care about or don't believe, they may be moved by your story, but they are not going to have their perspective changed.
How has your thinking about, I'm going to say messaging, but maybe we could say communicating change or getting people to for change to stick, whatever label we want to put on it very broadly. How has your approach or your thinking about this changed over either your career or, maybe the last 10 or 15 years?
One of the ways I describe it is I keep going upstream, right? I that, my, I would see something not work and I'm like, okay, well, what's the thing that's causing that to not work? Okay, let me see if I can fix that or determine what, and I keep going upstream, upstream, upstream. So I would say my understanding has deepened, first of all. Um, and my ability to articulate why things that I could observe didn't work earlier in my career. I now understand why they didn't work. Things that didn't feel right to me, like they just didn't feel right. Like, I don't like this. I don't like that somebody's telling me that this is the way to do this. It doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel honest, doesn't feel transparent, doesn't feel even morally or ethically right. Now I understand where that comes from too. Um, so I would say that like what's top of mind for me right now about what stands out for me as the most different from then to now is that understanding of how inextricably linked these two processes are, and that you you it you can talk to just one or the other, but you are lessening your probability of long-term success if you do. Um, Also, what I have now come to believe is that it does not need to be as painful and as long as everyone seems to think that it needs to be. Again, our lived experience would tell us that. But I also believe now I've gotten to this point, done enough research, done enough testing, done enough, all of this, that I do believe, current opinion is, that we can create the conditions for this kind of rapid, durable shift in thinking that, may not always qualify as fully transformational, but certainly leads to a shift. Um, I'd say the third big thing, and I'll leave it at that because again, I could talk about this for hours, is that there is a huge amount of common ground on which for us to base our conversations with each other that we are not currently treading. And what I mean by that is, I often think about it in terms of bands of beliefs, right? And I think the ones that get a lot of attention right now are the ones that are pulling apart from each other, right? Are, religious beliefs, uh, government, political beliefs, just all sorts of stuff, right? Identity based, and that is a problem. And so I feel great urgency around my work. At the same time, there's another band of beliefs, which is kind of what started me on this path three or 4 years ago. Though I read this article when it came out, very soon after it came out in 2019. So it's now been like cooking for about 6 years. 6 years? Did I do the math right? I don't know. 2019, whatever. Yes. And it was about primal beliefs. So this is work from Jer Clifton's lab out of University of Pennsylvania, and this idea that there is this baseline level of beliefs, that really underscore everything, and that they're pretty oppositional, right? That people fundamentally believe the world is a good place or a bad place or a beautiful place or an ugly place. I do talk about this in my second book because it was so foundational for that line of thinking. And though we seem to be born with them, is what he's found. Like, they don't seem to be dependent on socioeconomic status or childhood experience or whatever. In other words, you kind of seem to be there, and they're pretty darn stable over time. They can shift, but again, with my lens of leaders and folks that don't have a lot of time with people, and oftentimes don't have the opportunity for an actual dialogue. Again, we are in that situation a lot where we have to broadcast, we have to make a presentation, we have to make an announcement, we have to write an email, we have to write a paper or article or something. We don't have time. That's not an opportunity, right? So one of the first things that set in my mind from that was, oh, so it's really important that if you are making the case for something through a story or directly, that unless you're pretty darn sure that everybody in that audience shares a primal belief with you, do not anchor it in a primal belief. But right above that is this huge band of beliefs that I feel are underserved. And they go by a bunch of different names. That's part of the fun and the challenge of my doctoral research. Scientists and engineers and mathematicians would know them primarily as either axioms or first principles. In other words, like they are things like Newton's laws. They are just the generally accepted way of how things work most of the time, given our current state of knowledge. Very strongly related to that are kind of received wisdom over the years, right? Like, and you see some of those foundational principles show up in that, like what goes up must come down. And like, but things like, slow and steady wins the race, things like that. Right. And even there are some consistency in cultural beliefs, like and I think I mentioned this in the second book as well. It's just that, every religion, or philosophy generally has some version of what the Judeo-Christian tradition would call like the golden rule, right? Like do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And what I've seen over and over and over again in my work is that they are really effective as kind of supporting not just premises, but what argumentation theory, whatever, calls warrants, like justifications. When you use those kind of like foundational first principles, axioms, and whatever as like, this is why I believe in this, you get two benefits out of it right away. Number one, back to our double brain thing. Both brains get it. Both brains get it instantly. It passes that gut check. The intuitive brain is like, yep, absolutely. The logical brain, the analytical, they're both logical. The rational brain, the analytical brain goes, yeah, agree. Can't immediately disprove that. So I'll keep listening. Two, because they're commonly held and accepted, they are generally accepted to be true most of the time. So again, I'm going to keep my listening open to you. And yeah, I'm going to try to find the ways that it isn't true in this situation. But again, I've got enough of your attention and enough of your openness to continue the conversation. And the third thing, and this seems to be kind of a hidden benefit of it, is that, and this is something I'm learning from adult learning is that we're actually building on how people learn, because we're starting with a concept that people already know, already understand, already carries with it a bunch of other characteristics, qualities, concepts, etc. And then once we've kind of made sure that they understand and agree with the kind of why we're using it and how we're using that concept in this context, then again, they get it. They go, oh, I understand. I get the gist of it. I get why that would work or why you believe that. And they may not always agree, but I think from a business standpoint, that's actually, it at least speeds the opportunity to like find where that disagreement is and either find a different point of agreement or something else. But regardless, that would be a side project for me. I believe this group of what, Aaron, you know that I love a good Aristotelian word. So my new discovery of this one is endoxa, which is again generally accepted principles. They go with the axia of the axioms. That these endoxa there's way more of them than divisive political pundits and media would have us believe. And I think that gives us hope for all sorts of things. I think that gives us hope for collective action. I think that gives us hope for more civil discourse. I think that gives us hope for being able to, even just from a really practical standpoint, from marketing and branding, actually being able to find more people who are more likely to be aligned with your organization and brand from the get-go, provided, of course, you're operating from what those beliefs actually are for you. So again, long answer, but I think deeply about these things. So there you go.
Appreciate it. Regardless of my role, whether I'm in some form of leadership, marketing, coaching, whatever it is, sales. When you say things like, well, the mind is very complex or culture is complex or whatever, there's some group of people, and I feel like it's often large if I'm not doing a very good job communicating or I haven't built up some credibility, some large group of people receive that like, so the next thing you're going to tell me is, well, we really can't have any certainty about what message will stick or whatever else. And so I don't think that is generally true. I think it says more about, am I doing a good job communicating whatever I'm trying to communicate? And so I'm wondering, when you work with someone, how do you talk to them about, or how do you build certainty for them, some level of confidence that their message is going to achieve its goal?
A couple different ways. The first is, so stipulated, the world, culture, mind, people are complex. That said, I was delighted to discover, thanks to my husband, who Tom, who stumbled across it. And he's like, oh, I think you're going to like this. So there's a systems thinker, theorist named John Gall. And I'm paraphrasing him slightly, noted and observed that for any complex system that works, there is an underlying simple system that works. And that's generally true. This is why there are first principles and axioms of science and math, is because fundamentally those are the simple rules, the simple premises, which in combination create a simple system that underlies all the other more complex systems. So I often explain that from the first beginning and say, listen, I am not trying to simplify your idea. I am trying to find its most accessible entry points for the audience that you're talking to. And that's generally like, so again, there are like industry and doxa. We don't always have to go down to like, for, to get to zero, every positive needs a negative, which I did use one time when I was working with a company that builds carbon negative building materials. So I think that that makes sense to people. Because again, they'll do exactly what you did, which is you looked up and you did a quick check. And I'm like, is that true? Can I buy into that for the moment? Like, yeah. Are there probably situations where that may not be true? I don't know. I've said that to like evolutionary biologists and they're like, yes, correct. And I'm like, all right, I'm going to go with you on that. Again, I know I'm confirming my bias. I'm aware. Um, so that's one thing that is true. The second thing that I build in, particularly to the kind of, you know, the the underlying model. And so the red thread is, I now think of it as that's my narrative logic model. Like that's and then the model I'm working on now is very much a proxy for reasoning logic. How do we come to a decision about something? And the way that we address the complexity is that any particular anytime we're using that framework to articulate the core strategy and the case for it, for something, it is focused on a very specific question. Like that's how we're doing it in a context specific way so that we can say, to achieve this particular outcome, would you agree, based on these principles that you already generally would agree are true, that these elements are necessary for us to achieve that outcome, whatever it is? If so, this is Aristotle at work, basically said, then wouldn't you agree that it would at least be plausible that any combination of those things, like a combination of those things, would therefore be likely to achieve that outcome? And then again, depending on what context we're using this on, we can then say, that's what we think too. Here's how we can now show you that we do that. Now you start to hang on the customer testimonials or how you've got the systems and processes or features built into your product or services that deliver those things. But that's what I'm helping to establish for people is like, listen, we got to give them a container. We've got to give them a snapshot that they can process and kind of just give a quick check on. And then we can layer on the complexity and the nuance. And it's, sometimes I've seen it as a parallel to, Seth Godin's yeah, seminal concept of permission marketing. And I see this as kind of permission influence or permission persuasion, because you're not in this kind of approach. Like you've got to get a check of understanding and agreement before it even makes sense to proceed. Because if you don't understand the general idea, and if you don't understand or agree that it could work, right, then there's really not much point in me going further until we've established agreement on those things. Because any failure point down the line is probably going to come back to some foundational misunderstanding or disagreement in that underlying rationale for that change, that idea in the first place. So, another thing that's just been bopping around my head lately is that, I think that, can you ensure that a change, let's say an organizational change, is going to be successful in 90 seconds? No, but you sure can make sure that in 90 seconds you don't ensure its future failure, right? And again, I just think a lot of changes, a lot of product launches, a lot of offerings die at the point of first explanation. And that is a line from my first book. So that has never changed. I still believe that. But ultimately it is, yes, things are complex, but I don't think they need to be as complex as we make them out to be to start. Because let's just make sure that everybody's on the same page, and then we can add words to it.
Where is all of this taking you, or where do you think it's taking you at the moment in terms of, I forget how you stated it. I don't think that it was my next book. I think it was more like the model that you're using right now or developing or whatever. Is all of this taking you to a one framework to rule them all? Is it just going to those higher levels or deeper levels depending on the direction we want to go?
Yeah, I mean, so it's not one framework to rule them all. Like I said, I think it's they achieve different things, and of the two frameworks that I have right now, one I call the core case, or the ITBA, which stands for if then because and. That's the reasoning model, and then there's the red thread, which is the narrative model. Um, uh, they work complementarily. Complementarily. I don't know what the word. if you are working on a red thread, understanding the ITBA will make a stronger red thread. You can, I think, assess and establish quick understanding and agreement with the ITBA in 90 seconds, but you would need a red thread to build out how you would then make the case, and most logically and most engagingly and most intuitively, um uh just to kind of get that engagement that any story structure is going to give you, because you're going to need something that helps guide how you add additional information to that very short court case, because again, it's 4 sentences, so super quick. So from a directional standpoint, I can see from a commercialization standpoint how they work together. Like, I generally believe, yeah, you got to start with the ITBA if something is not working, like in a case, in an ad, in a pitch, in a talk, in a book, in a whatever. It's probably because something is broken at the underlying rationale at that ITBA court case level. Something's missing, something's not there. You're making, either you're not justifying your point of view, you're not making a complete claim. There's a lot of different places it can go wrong, which were still in operation with the red thread. I just have now a lot more clarity about what those pieces are and why they're so critical in a story. So, but from a directional standpoint, I think what I am, from an academic standpoint, the first point of call or first port of call is to really verify the fact that this idea, like that they're just is to either find or establish what it is that's required for that accelerated perspective change. Like, and so I have, kind of working backwards from the model, right? I have some ideas, but, taking now a true scholarly, like rigorous empirical research approach, really figuring out, okay, I believe my model works, and I believe it works for these reasons, but that is not how one approaches research, right? Where one approaches research from, what do we know already about fast perspective change, those kind of epiphanies, those aha moments, those kinds of things. And if we know something, and right now that seems to be a big if, at least in learning, to what extent, like, then it's about, like, how does my model line up with that? What would need to happen with my model to line up with established theory? And then it would be, let me empirically test the model to see whether or not in use, does it in fact shifts people's perspectives? And if I really want to establish transformation, which has an actual academic definition, I would need to do follow-up work to see the degree to which those shifts, if they occurred, persisted. So it really is going in, like, deep into the weeds of, like, what are the underlying processes behind accelerated perspective change, because the incremental perspective change is fairly well understood, about how that happens, what's required, how do you support it, but it doesn't seem to be as well understood about the other side, particularly outside of crisis situations. So a lot of times when people think about, like, a sudden shift in how they see the world, it's because something awful has happened. And while I'm not uninterested in that, I am more interested in the more common use case where, outside of a crisis situation, right? A leader, a founder, a author, a thinker, just somebody, a human, right, has a situation where they want to share their point of view with somebody else in such a way that there's the greatest likelihood that somebody else will adopt that same point of view. And it seems from preliminary poking that there's a lot of work to do there. So I'm excited.
So whether it's reading your books, following you on LinkedIn, something else, what what's the best way for me to learn more, connect? And then, we've had such a short time today, so maybe you can point me in a direction or something that, or maybe we didn't get to a topic, but is there something you would want me to think about or a point you would want to reiterate or leave me with in addition
Yeah.
to where do I go?
Sure. So where to go? I believe I am still the only Tamsen Webster spelled this way, Tamsen Webster, like the dictionary, in the searchable universe. So I'm pretty easy to find. I'm most active on LinkedIn. If you want to kind of follow along as these ideas burble up, which is how like anybody who's followed me for a long time knows that the ideas show up first in my newsletter. So I would hope recommend signing up for that. I do also post those as articles on LinkedIn. Um, yeah, stay tuned. And thanks to Jen Hines on my team, she makes sure that it gets out in other formats too. So, but to learn more about this, since I haven't, since I've, again, I in scattered ways, it's in my newsletter and on the kind of content page of the Message Design Institute, which is where I'm kind of putting all of this stuff going forward. I would say that filling in, no matter what your position is, that starting to fill in your gaps around kind of processing of information and language would be really helpful. So I would say 3 books come to mind that have been really have been just A, interesting, like a good read, and B, really helpful. So the first one, classic recommendation, is Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. That is like the book about what's more officially known as dual process theory, but is like that's where this idea of, not by those terms, this analytic automatic brain, really how that plays in. And he won a Nobel Prize for some of the research underneath that, so it's reliable. And a lot of the other stuff you see people talk about is really just that stuff watered down. All right. Second book I'd recommend, which was actually the next 2 books are both recommended to me by a very interesting fellow named Owen Fitzpatrick, who I would also recommend you follow. He really studies the kind of psychology of belief. He recommends 2 books. I read them both, and they were both very solid recommendations. One was How Minds Change. Donald Rainey. I always get the first name wrong, but it's called How Minds Change.
David McRaney, maybe?
McRaney. I don't know. I keep thinking of that guy from Coach, that actor, and I always want to make the name wrong. But then the last one is, again, I'm not going to get the author's name right because that's not how my brain works, but I remember the title of the book. I remember the concept. So How I Change is really good because it really does talk about some of these transformational belief shifts and does go into some of the ways that people have been trying to do that and what some of the mechanisms are. A book that was a beautiful pair with it, and so I'm glad he recommended at the same time, was a book called The Ancient Art of Thinking for Yourself. And it is actually a book about, this doesn't sound interesting, it's fascinating. It's about the history of rhetoric, right? And combined with the kind of like most up-to-date understanding of how we come to make decisions about things. And so, it's very much positioned. I think the book is from 2016. So the timing of that book is and what was happening here in the US during that time is very influential on what they're talking about there. But I also found that deeply fascinating and also reassuring that in any moment, that regularly, even back to like ancient Greece, that in moments where we rhetoric and language and speech and persuasion and influence have been used against a society, there has been a wave coming in afterwards of setting us up for better success the next time around. And so, yeah, I think it's a good note to end on because to me, I feel like if I could play some role in that happening this time around, that would be the mark of a life well lived.
I can well imagine the situation in which you finish your doctorate and the next book is out and you're having a big influence. So I hope that is the case. I don't know if that's exactly what you're saying, but I could see, the New York Times cover or whatever with Tamsen Webster on there.
Fabulous. I'll take it. Yeah. I mean, would that all be nice? Yes. It's part of why I founded the Message Design Institute in the first place. I actually really, and it is part of why I wanted to go to school, because to me, the fastest path to impact is through the academics, because it's the academics that get that they talk to each other, their stuff gets built, like other people's ideas get built on other people's ideas. And it's the academics that, in various rings of distance get cherry picked for business books, thought leadership, get spread out that way. So again, it was another example of me going as upstream as possible so that I could have as much downstream effect as I could. So that's what I'm trying to do. And it really is. I say this with all honesty. I would love to like make $1 bajillion from it, but it's actually way more important to me to give people tools for, first and foremost, for getting new important ideas out into the world faster. And if secondarily it achieves what I think it might, which is allowing people to have conversations across differences of all kinds, cognitive, experiential, developmental, socioeconomic, and at the same time to be able to ask just one layer deeper of question when somebody tells you something and just say, oh, why do you believe that? And again, not in an aggressive way, but in a curious way, so that it just starts that very natural process of somebody having to justify to themselves what it is that drives that belief. Because I think right now we're in a situation where people, even for themselves, aren't necessarily always stepping back and going, well, wait a minute. Why do I believe that's right? Right. And that's fine. Like if you can like test it and it still stands up, more power to you. It's the alternative that's empowering. Like when you realize that there may be a different way to see things that actually feels more right to you than whatever you're feeling now. And that has downsides too. I'm not trying to be, too starry-eyed about all that. But like I said, I feel a great deal of urgency about this work. And whatever I can do to get it out faster is, while still hewing and honoring it what it needs to be successful, I will do it.
Well, I'm very interested in it, as I hope you can tell, and I won't ask any more questions because I have kept you over time, so I really want to respect your schedule, but I will be following and
Please
hopefully
do. Please
learning
do.
more from what you share. So thank you, Tamsen.
It's been lovely to catch up and to just, chat about deep things with you.
Thank you. I appreciate that.